review you are hoping to compose. And so I'll briefly overview the different types. So today, instead, I wanted to give you some resources for synthesizing the literature, specifically focused on high stakes documents. So I know that Lauren is getting ready to write her honors thesis. Marcus is moving into the dissertation stage. Red's finishing up coursework and will soon be moving into comprehensives. And Tori is in the dissertation stage right now. So I think you're all right in the midst of it. And normally we would want to catch you a little bit earlier, like around where Lauren is. She's just finished kind of talking with her advisor and gotten some ideas, and we'd like to get you right where Lauren is and Red is in the process. Some of the topics, as I said, we're going to talk about what a literature review is briefly, and what different types of literature reviews there are in relation to their purposes, and to your research worthy question, which is an important part of the process. When we were getting started, Tori mentioned the fact that it's just so hard to narrow it down when you have so much material. And so we have to keep going back to what is the question that our study, or if it's a chapter-based dissertation that is not written in an EBRAD format, what is the topic of that individual chapter and what question is that chapter seeking to answer? And that will help narrow the topic for you. We'll briefly mention conducting a thorough search. I'm not going to teach you how to do a search, but I strongly encourage everyone here to schedule a research consultation with one of Kresge Library's librarians. Not only do they have a breadth of knowledge about the different databases that are more appropriate for your subject matter, but they know the keywords that you need to use. I can't tell you how many times I've been working with someone and they've said to me, well, I just can't find anything on that topic. And I said, well, what terms were you searching under? And they gave a couple terms. And I said, well, that's also referred to as X. And the light bulb goes on and we pull up the search bar, not to take over the librarian's role. And all of a sudden they find, oh, no wonder people were telling me I had missed a lot of the literature. I wasn't searching under the correct term. And then I would like to give you a little bit of a resource, a couple of them on preparing and organizing your review. And finally, how to get started with the writing. So this is pretty much what I envision us talking about for the rest of this evening. And of course, I'll talk about a few of the pitfalls along the way. I can talk about these pitfalls. Why? Because I've fallen into these pits before, or I've been fortunate enough to fall into them vicariously through the experience of other people. And it's my hope that by sharing other people's experiences with you, both good and bad, we can help you avoid the bad and embrace some of the more effective patterns. I've got a little video
when
I wanted to give you.
I'd write long essays
and of
that
course,
I'd work on for days.
I have to get this commercial out of the way first.
Writing a literature review is an inevitable part of being a graduate student. So before spending hours of your time working on a project involving a literature review, it helps to understand what a literature review is and why it is important. You may need to do a literature review as a part of a course assignment, a capstone project, or a master's thesis or dissertation. No matter the context, a literature review is an essential part of the research process. Some important functions of a literature review are that it helps you to understand a research topic and develop your own perspective on a problem. Not only that, it lets you show your instructor or thesis committee what you know about the topic. Your instructor or advisor may assume you know what a literature review is and that you understand what they are expecting from you. You might hear,
and I will say that for those of you here and many of the people I've worked with over the years, that's probably the most common misconception, that people hear the words literature review and they think they assume they know what that means, or what actually the literature refers to. When I'm looking at a literature review, for example, it's very important that I know that you know the literature. We're talking about academic scholarship and even more specifically, empirical research. And so often I've gone to look at somebody's study with them and realized that they were citing newspaper articles, CDC reports, which are relevant to someone's dissertation, but they're not going to be part of a literature review. So it's this getting to know you stage where we start to understand what do these words mean, like literature, and what does it mean to conduct a literature review?
This is like, what does the literature show us? Connect your ideas to the literature. Survey the literature on the topic. Well, before you can review the literature, you need to make sure you know what is meant by the literature. A good definition of the literature is that it is a collection of all the scholarly writings on a topic. These writings can be in the form of scholarly peer-reviewed articles, books, and other sources like conference proceedings. These may be called annual meetings or conventions. The literature also includes dissertations written by other graduate students. Collectively, these make up the literature. Visually, the literature might look like this. Often there are major works that have been written on a topic, and then other later works that build on them. These later works tend to be extending or responding to the original papers in some way. Basically, the literature is a continuously evolving network of scholarly works that interact with each other. As you do your own research, you'll begin to understand the relationships in this evolving web and how your own ideas connect to it.
I'm John Klass, an Associate Professor of Biological and Agricultural Engineering at North Carolina State University. Research is about telling a story, kind of like a chain story where each writer starts with a partial story created by others and takes it where the imagination leads.
And I think that I loved the way that the first speaker described it as an evolving network. I tend to, like John Clayson, refer to it as a research story, but it's important that we realize that we're situated within this conversation, story, or network, and it's our job as the author to lay bare this network, to help our readers understand the connections, to make the connections for them, to lay them bare so that other researchers come along and they see what we've uncovered so far and the connections we've made, and then they can build on them going forward. So it's this ethical responsibility as much as it is a task-oriented responsibility.
Existing literature is the story so far. You have to know where you are before you can go forward. But research is not just one linear story. Many different lines of study contribute to the story you are trying to write. Your job in the literature review is to see where all the loose ends are in the various fields of study that are most closely related to what you want to do, and then to figure out what needs to be done next. The background to any good story has to be explained carefully, or the reader doesn't know why one thing is important and something else is not. The reader has to understand what's going on. In the same way, researchers need the background in the literature of their discipline to know what is going on in their field of study.
So how do you turn a network of articles into a cohesive review of the literature? How do you find and tell the story behind your research topic? Reviewing the literature is like participating in a conversation. As you read and evaluate articles, you begin to understand how they are connected and how they form the story that the authors are telling. Then you start to formulate your own response or contribution. This process, discovering relationships in the literature and developing and connecting your own ideas to it, is what helps you turn a network of articles into a coherent review of the literature. So what does a literature review look like? There are different types of literature reviews that you may encounter or be required to write while in graduate school. Literature reviews can range from being selective to comprehensive. They can also be part of a larger work or stand alone. A course assignment is an example of a selective review. It focuses on a small segment of the literature on a topic and makes up the entire work. The literature review in a thesis or dissertation is an example of a comprehensive review that is part of a larger work. Most research articles begin with a selective literature review to establish the context for the research reported in the paper. Often, this is part of the introduction. Other literature reviews are meant to be fairly comprehensive and also to stand alone. This means that the entire article is devoted to reviewing the literature. A literature review that introduces an article can look like this. Here is an article about cognitive behavioral therapy. Here is the literature review. In this article, it is part of the introduction. You can tell that the introduction includes a literature review because it discusses important research that has already been published on this topic. Here is an example of a standalone literature review article, in this case about employment. The article's title states that this is a review of the literature on the topic. However, not all review articles will have the term literature review in their title. In-depth review articles like this are an excellent starting place for research on a topic. So at this point, you may be asking yourself just what's involved in writing a literature review, and how do I get started? Writing a literature review is a process with several key steps. Let's look at each part of this process in more detail. Your first step involves choosing, exploring, and focusing your topic. At this stage, you might discover that you need to tweak your topic or the scope of your research as you learn more about the topic in the literature. Then, of course, you'll need to do some research using article databases, the library catalog, Google Scholar, and other sources to find scholarly information. All along, you'll be using your brain. You'll want to evaluate what you find and select articles, books, and other publications that will be the most useful. Then you will need to read through these articles and try to understand, analyze, and critique what you read. While researching and organizing your paper, you'll collect a lot of information from many different sources. You can use citation management software like RefWorks, EndNote, or Zotero to help you stay organized. Then, of course, you'll need to write and revise your paper and create your final bibliography. One more thing, writing a literature review is a process, but it is not always a linear process. One step does lead to another, but sometimes your research or reading will point you back to earlier steps as you learn more about your topic and the literature. At this point, you might be wondering, how do I actually review the literature I find? Let's look at what it means to review the literature. In the most general sense, it means that you collect and read all the relevant papers and other literature on your topic. You want to provide an overview, but also highlight key concepts and important papers. As you read, you may start by describing and summarizing each article. Then you can start to make connections by comparing and contrasting those papers. You will also need to evaluate, analyze, and organize the information from your reading. When you work with the literature, you will read and critically examine articles and books to see what's important or out of scope, and analyze arguments for strengths and weaknesses. When working with the literature, it is important to look for relationships between publications. Some of the important relationships between publications that you discover might include major themes and important concepts, as well as critical gaps and disagreements. But don't fall into the trap of making your review a laundry list of summaries of the works you read. A literature review is not an annotated bibliography. Your goal should be to go one step further and integrate and synthesize what you find in the literature into something new. Ideally, you will create your own conceptual map or outline of the literature on your topic. For example, let's say as you read, you discover 3 major concepts that are important in the literature and relevant to your research. You should then identify how the literature, that is, the content in individual articles, books, and other publications, relates to the concepts you discovered. Some publications may be relevant to several concepts. Others may apply to only one concept. What's important is that you develop and present your own organization and understanding of the literature. Then, when you write your literature review, you will end up with a document that is organized by the concepts and relationships you found and developed based on your reading and thinking. Your review will not only cover what's been published on your topic, but will include your own thoughts and ideas. You will be telling the specific story that sets the background and shows the significance of your research. Researching and writing a good literature review is a challenging and sometimes intimidating process. Don't be afraid to seek assistance, whether from your advisor or instructor, campus writing center, or your librarian. Many librarians have subject specialties and can be especially helpful in identifying valuable resources and showing you how to obtain relevant information.
You might have seen videos like this before, but here's the big secret. Anyone can make.
Before we move further, I'd like to use that that brief video, about 9 minutes, because it's kind of a micro view of everything that I wanted to talk about. But I thought I would just ask if anybody here might just note a few of the things that that stood out to you as you were listening to it. Maybe something that never occurred to you before, or you noticed the way that they staged the process for you and you thought, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Because I can tell you the reasons I chose it, but I'd really like to hear what was going through your head as you were listening to this 9-minute micro view of what I'm talking about tonight.
I like the idea, Sherry, that it was like you have to tell the backstory so that the reader understands the context. I've never thought of it in that way, but I liked the analogy to literature in that kind of way. And I think that's something that clients will really resonate with as well. So I think I will use that. That's a good way of explaining it.
Yeah, I'm so glad you picked up on that. So often people get stuck in the fact that they have to read so many and cite so many sources, but the reason for doing so seems to disappear. So it's more task oriented. I must do this, I must show it. But they almost feel like I'm doing it to prove that I read something. I'm doing it to prove that I've earned my right. And that's part of it. But you're doing it to make connections for people, to prepare them, because although the audience for a dissertation lit review are people who have already gotten PhDs, the people who are going to evaluate you, and many of the people who are going to make decisions about you, but they're not experts in your topic. You actually are likely to be a better expert by the time you finish this document than they are. And they need you to show the path that you've gone through, to give them the context that helps them zero in. They draw upon their experience as academics and as scholars, but they rely on you to show them the path. And part of that is contextualizing it. I love how it goes through, and it's not just popping in studies here and there, but we're showing the terrain almost like we're looking at a map, and we're plotting all of the different studies that have been done and points of view on an individual question or topic, and drawing attention to where has the work not been done. Where is the work inconclusive? And where is your study coming in to do something different from previous work? Because again, we're not just retraversing past ground and proving to everybody that we've done our homework. We are entering the field and becoming experts by doing this work. Anybody else want to make a comment about it?
In the video, I like how they the intro concept A, B, and C is kind of how I write mine currently right now. So it kind of gives like a reassurance, like that I'm doing it correctly, or that I look at it a different way, like where you say you're taking different articles and you putting major themes and concepts and explaining on that separately. So I like that part.
So seeing the connections between, like, identifying major topic areas and then making connections between and among them. I'm also hoping that people noticed the point about it not being linear. when you are in the process, like many of you had to write a proposal, and for some departments, a proposal consists of the first 3 chapters. And so you write a preliminary lit review. But the reality is, at that time, you haven't done the study. And if you're doing a typical introduction, then you're having a lit review, then a methods chapter, then a findings chapter, then a discussion chapter and conclusion. Once you've done the study, you may have to go back in and you may have to draw upon additional literature. You may have findings and things that suggest that you need to look in a wider plane, or you may have to narrow things down more than you did. So you start off and the literature might lead you to different stopping points, and that may cause you at some point to circle back around, take some things out, add some things in, widen it, even sometimes to reorganize the way that you've originally organized your A, B's, and C's that Marcus was just talking about. So it can be a very challenging, but it's also a very rewarding process when what you encounter encourages you to see again. When we talk about a revision, we're talking about to revise, to re-see what we've already seen, to look at it with fresh eyes. And that can happen when we're going through the literature as well. And let's face it, the most interesting progress gets made when people go back through previous studies with different questions and they ask, why did no one ever do this? Why didn't they approach it from with a study that looked at this? What don't we know? What do we currently know? And can we trust what we currently know? So anyway, it's enough about that introductory video. I will share, I think.
I have a comment.
Oh, sure. Sorry.
Actually, she mentioned in the video about the types of literature review, and she mentioned that one type of it is selective, I believe.
Yes.
So here I need clarification, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I mean, when you are selective in picking the literature that will be relevant to your research, does that mean that you like the articles and you like the finding and the result and the data, or you have to be, otherwise you'll be biased in this case, or just you have to be exactly objective in this? Go ahead.
Selective literature reviews are much more common when you're at the coursework stage, where we don't have the time to read everything in a certain field, where we haven't committed to a big project. So they might have given you an assignment to read 10 articles that look at X, and to let us know based on those 10 articles what the field looks like and what the concerns are. But you raise a very important question. The word selective does indicate limitations. And it might be selective also because although there are 6 main important topics in the field, you're saying, while there is much literature out there on X, Y, and Z, for the purpose of this review, we're only going to look at X. But in no case should we ever make decisions about what goes in and what gets left out based on, I like these findings and they confirm what I want to find, or, hey, this was real readable and it made it easier for me. That's always great, but that's not part of the definition of selective, and I'm glad you brought it up. But I'll admit, a lot of people do it that way. Or, gosh, these things were available online in my library. The other things weren't, and I would have had to go through interlibrary loan, or I would have had to get something translated. So convenience should never be one of the criterion of our data collection. It should never be based simply on convenience or on confirmation bias, which is what you brought up earlier. Very good point.
Thank you very much.
But there also are things like scoping reviews. There are reviews that are actually academic studies. You can do an empirical study that is a literature review. It's a review of all the past literature in the field. So a literature review is such a broad and vast genre. So when we speak of it today, we're primarily talking about the dissertation lit review. But yes, it's so important that we realize that the genre of lit review is plural. And what a literature review is going to look like for Marcus in educational leadership may be different from what it looks like for Victoria in psychology and for you in your field.
I love that question because I hated when they used the word selective because I was like, that's just fishing. But that was such a good point because to me, what stuck out the most was the ethical obligation to report others' findings because they did work hard to write those papers. And I think that point just tied it nicely, really well, that like it's also our ethical obligation to look at both sides and every type of finding.
And it is true more often than it should be that people do, being human with limited time and resources and with goals like getting awards, getting finished, that too often people don't do their job. And that's why when we read other people's work, we have to be critical of just relying on their findings. We need to take a good look at what they built their study on. So one of the first things I do when I am making decisions about what I'm going to build my own work on is I go to an article and I go to their works cited page or their references page. And I look for things like timeliness and breadth. And do I know some of the important names in the field? Are they being addressed directly or indirectly? You know, we don't always have to go all the way back to Freud, for example, if we're talking about psychoanalysis, but are some important ideas that are either being displaced or responded to, are they represented in the literature review? So I look to see on what basis did they draw their conclusions? And a big part of that will be what literature did they draw upon? Now, sometimes if you don't see a lot, as you might find, they might be representing an issue that is in the early stages that not many people have written about. Or it could be an issue like in one of the fields that I work in where portfolios for assessment were really big and they were looked at a lot 20 years ago. Nobody's really writing on them now. So if you were going to revisit the concept of writing assessment via portfolios, you likely would not find a lot of timely literature on that. But as the author, you have to address that in your lit review. You have to help us understand why there's this big gap, why a lot of the literature left off 20 years ago. And you might also have to extrapolate from other fields to make some suggestions. And then you're going to have to make the case that they didn't settle everything 20 years ago, that you're revisiting this now because there are many issues that have been left unaddressed, because we don't just revisit things for the heck of it. We always have to have a rationale. You guys are great. So I'd like to move on with our discussion. And I just want to draw our attention. So that was our overview of the whole thing. And I just want to draw our attention to a few things, maybe another way of saying some of which was drawn out during that 9-minute video. This article by Boot and Belay, I can't make a strong enough argument about how good it would be for anybody writing a lit review to take a look at it. And I've actually linked to the article, and it has a figure in it that provides you with a mechanism for evaluating the strengths and weaknesses of literature reviews. But I really liked this quote. And I'm only going to look at a couple pieces of it because I know you all know how to read. Good research is good because it advances our collective understanding. And a researcher cannot perform significant research without first understanding the literature in the field. So you might have a tendency to get a little too much in a hurry. And maybe you've heard people on TV, you're listening to the news and somebody says something like, well, everybody already knows that. Or a politician advances a concept as if there's only one right answer. They know it, their party knows it, and they're laying it out there. And the reason we don't jump into doing our research without a thorough understanding of the literature is that we weren't available for the full conversation. Some of you are in your 20s and 30s. I'm now in my 50s. That conversation has been going on for quite a long time. I joined the conversation about dissertation writers and dissertation supervisors, but I didn't join that conversation until 2000. People were talking about these issues before, and they continue to talk about them. I've taken a couple of years where I've refocused my attention on other things. If I were to pick back up after my dissertation and start writing again on doctoral supervision, I would need to review the literature over the last 3 years, literature that I haven't been following since I published a couple things because I've been working on a few new things. So it's really understanding that I've got to have a sense of the full terrain before I jump in and start making claims about what needs to happen or how I'm going to research it or where the gap lies, because maybe that gap has been filled. Or maybe somebody's framed it differently and helped me to see something that I overlooked. Another quote from them, and I promise I won't repeat their whole article here, but this one, the literature review, it sets the broad context of this study. You guys already mentioned that. It helps us to justify our decision to do our research. It also situates all of the previous work by other scholars that is relevant into this broader context. But I'm going to do more than just say an author, a scholar did this in 2019 and he found X. Well, a literature review is not my opinion, and it's not meant to be all about me. I'm in there shaping it. How am I shaping it? By what goes in and what doesn't go in, what's relevant, what isn't, how I shape the terms or the main ideas that get looked at. But also, if there are places where scholars disagree about something, it's my job to draw attention to the fact that more than one scholar has a different way of explaining something, and to help readers understand why that might be. So although I'm going to say one scholar is wrong and another scholar is right, that's not appropriate. I may explain that the different findings could be explained by the fact that one was a long-term study of thousands of children over 3 decades, whereas another study was a small sample conducted X by a researcher within his or her own context. So I'm not saying researcher 2 is wrong and researcher 1 has the right conclusions, but if I see a major gap between their findings, it is my job to try to figure out what might explain it, and also to help the readers look at that and say, hey, maybe my study is designed to enter this area of contested terrain and to do a new study that might help us figure out, is it because of that or could it be something else? And if any point when we're going through this, because I see this as kind of a resource share today more than a formal presentation where I'm just shoving a lot of information at you, just interrupt me if you have something to share. I'd like that. So we'll make this much more informal because we're a small group. But now I'd just like to make sure we're all on the same page when it comes to what is the purpose of the literature review. And I think from the different threads, from our conversation, from the video, we see a few important points here. One, is we want to have this area where we kind of overview. Here are the known entities. Here's what's been happening in this field for a while on this specific topic. So to give us kind of a nice overview to sum up what we know. And as part of that, it's not just what we know, but how we came to know it, which gets at the research methods. And a lot of times when people are talking about conducting a lit review, they forget that sometimes it's the approach that was taken to doing the research that is equally important to our discussion in the lit review. Not every lit review is going to spend a great deal of time talking about research methods and different approaches, but particularly in a contested topic where we're really struggling with an issue, we're going to be looking very closely at the research methods and techniques that have been used to answer the question. Part of it is also, as I said, to critique existing studies, not to validate them or to invalidate them. That's not the role of our lit review, but to draw attention to some limitations that we may have noticed. I was working with somebody just before the holiday break, and she was finishing her first critique of a scholarly article. And she said, well, you know, it all looks good. It's got all the parts. I'm struggling. Why do they want me to critique this article? And I read through the article and I said, well, the very beginning of the article, they mention that money for the study was given by a specific child care institute, and what the child care institute is, and mentioned that the researcher is the co-researcher is employed by that institution. Now, in the study, like most studies, it does not say the research was conducted at that school. And that's very common. That's not dishonest. That's just, we generally tend to protect our research subjects by not being very specific about where it was done. But it was very clear to me as I started reading the study with her that the site of the research was the very place that the co-researcher worked. So that was one thing. They gave money. They collect money for a living to take care of children. They're advancing a theory that is not commonly accepted. And the theory was that their approach to dealing with autism was superior to other places. And it didn't take a rocket scientist for me to infer that there could be a potential conflict there and a little bit of problem. And so I mentioned that to her. And then she remembered and she said, you know, that makes sense. And then let's go and look at the research subjects, because they only had 3 research subjects and one of them dropped out before the end of the study. And I said, okay, now you're in a place. And she said they made some pretty strong claims for their findings, and they did. And so she was in a better position to critique that study and their conclusions than she was when she started. Of course, she wasn't saying they're dirty, rotten liars, that they are just trying to sell their school to people whose kids have autism. We don't know any of that to be true, but they made strong claims that they could not make on the basis of 2 participants and the researcher who was situated in that very place and did not do anything. The methodology didn't do anything to show her embeddedness. Another thing is to highlight inconsistencies, and I've already brought that up. So that's part of what we're looking at. We might highlight inconsistencies across studies as part of our critique. We always want to identify a gap, because if there's no gap, then what are we doing this research for? Our job is to extend the existing body of knowledge. to make a place for our research. If people get to the end of our spiel and they say, so what? We have not accomplished that. So part of the job of the lit review is to allow us to show that there are missing pieces, and our study in that next chapter and that next section, if it's chapter by chapter, and a lot of people do those. I know Tori's study is set up chapter by chapter. So the next piece is, okay, here's what we know. This is why I'm doing this study in the way that I'm doing it. And finally, to keep providing that context or framing for your research, which is now you're ready to see my methodology, because I've shown that there is this gap. There are some contested findings, and I think I've determined a way to approach this problem that is going to help give us greater certainty about how we should proceed. Can I ask right for a moment? I'm just going to stop here and just ask if anybody has any questions. Or comments?
I
Yeah,
have a
Marcus.
question.
Sure.
When you say, I understand what you mean by contestant findings, that means somebody who has a different, conclusion off the similar topic. When you say gap, do you mean the areas that hasn't been researched yet? And then when you say, can you speak a little bit more about that?
Sure. A
Because
gap
most
could
of us has
be
been-
multiple things. A gap could be, we haven't done certain kinds of research. So it could be that we've done a lot of quantitative research on something and we've gotten a lot of yes or no, or we've confirmed a hypothesis or disproved a hypothesis, but we need something that now goes in there and helps us figure out like the why. So a gap could be a type of research. The gap could be questions that haven't been asked by other researchers. The gap could be questions that have been asked and we still don't know the answer. And so you're going to propose a different way to try to get at the answer, or you're going to propose a potential different answer to the question. Anybody else want to add to that?
I have heard this, and I think it's really good at way to phrase it. A gap is not a gaping hole. It's not something you're going to fall right into, like, oh, look, this is where my study fits. It can be something as simple as like a replication. You're redoing someone else's study because you think you're gonna booster their results and support them, and that you think that would make a strong case because you want to increase their sample size, or you think something could be different, or it honestly is something is missing. So I do a puzzle box study in carnivores, and puzzle boxes have been done in other species, and other cognitive tasks have been done in carnivores, but it was never like meshed perfectly. So I think I am like the prime like subject for a gap, but it doesn't usually happen that nicely.
And you can think about the reason why today we have so many anti-vaxxers. The original fudged research that suggested that vaccines caused autism. People had not had similar research showing that vaccines caused autism. This study came around and others did exactly what Tori said. They set out, because this research sounded, it didn't sit well with them. And even if it did, they said, my job is to make sure we don't test something one time and say it's a done deal. And they could not get the same results. And it came out, and after enough researchers did the same thing, that the research wasn't legitimate. Now that's on the far end of things. Usually we find out somebody made a mistake, and that's happened quite a bit when we trained our consultants for our statistical consulting program. We started paying attention to the most common statistical mistakes that people make. And studies have had to be pulled because people ran the wrong test or used the wrong set of numbers and later went back through and found their mistake. So we're not always looking for something like that or going to come across something like that, but it can happen. So we'll move forward. And I think we've pretty much looked at all these purposes, but just for the sake of those of you who like a more visual representation, to have a sense of the spoke and the wheels, all the different things that go into this, you start to appreciate, I guess it's working with people in so many different fields, particularly in the sciences. I want them to respect and understand why they're expected to spend so much time culling the literature and not just slapping some studies in, so-and-so found this, then so-and-so found that, but to really understand that the important work they're doing in all of these trials and in the lab, and they're spending hours and hours doing it. And I so respect that. That work is so, it hinges on the good work that they did here. At the beginning of today, I was talking to Lauren, and she's one of our undergraduate consultants who is in the Honors College. And she had a meeting with her advisor a little bit earlier, and they're kind of fleshing out their research question. But as I said before, it's important to help. We can't represent everything. Gosh, it's been going on 15 years ago. I sat down with a nurse. She was working on her DNP project. It's kind of like a PhD, but it's called the DNP, Doctorate of Nursing Practice. So they write a big paper. And she came in and she had, I'm not kidding, 25 Redwell folders that were all about this wide on a cart. She brought them on a cart from her office across campus into the library to meet with me. And I said, what's this? And she said, this is all my material for my lit review. And I thought, okay, I read a lot of stuff and I'm an overkill person, but this doesn't look right. And she had been working on her proposal, trying to write her lit review for her proposal for 2 years. And I said, well, what's your topic? And it was a specific type of nursing practice. But she had 2 Redwell folders full of articles, I am not kidding, on like Florence Nightingale and early nursing. And I said, okay, why? Well, I have to represent everything. And that's when we had to have that discussion about, well, yes, everything that is relevant, but please help me understand how Florence Nightingale, way back when, out on the field, tending wounded soldiers and others, is relevant to your nursing practice today. By the end of our meeting, the majority of those Redwell folders had been put on the bottom shelf, and we had about 2 or 3 of them on the top. And then we had gone through them and pulled some articles up to the top because we had created that matrix that was shown in the video of here are the key people and here are some other articles that you can reference to show that you've continued on from these early people. And her communal nursing theory, she defended her proposal the next month. So what is your question? What are the key words that you're going to search for? Is that question too broad? You know, like when I first started studying dissertation supervision, I wanted to know everything about your supervisors, the people who serve as your chairs on your committees. But I also knew that I couldn't answer every question in my dissertation. And the more I read, and you have to do a certain amount of reading in the literature before you can specify your question. So this is another moment where it's not linear. You do a lot of reading. Some of this stuff will end up being put aside for your next study or for never. It just informed you. And once I did, I kept coming across this consistent theme that many of them did the same thing that their own advisors had done to them. They mentioned, well, I just did it this way. Well, why did you do it that way? Because my advisor did it this way. But what was most compelling to me was that in many cases, what their advisor had done with them and to them was negative, and it didn't work. And yet they kept telling us, but this is why I do it my way with my own students today. That became a research question for me, something that motivated me as I started looking at the habits and practices of supervisors. So you're looking for patterns. You're breaking the question down into component parts. And so I decided for mine, I had like 3 levels of questions. I wanted to know what their experience as supervisees was like. I wanted to know what their experience as a supervisor now is like. So what was their experience when they were on the other side of the chair trying to finish a dissertation, working with their supervisor? Then what was their experience like with their own supervisees? So tell me, what kinds of things happen? What things do you do with your students? What kinds of situations arise with your students? And they weren't even necessarily aware of some of the parallels. And then finally, we sit down and we ask questions about what they thought was most important in the life of a supervisor. And what's fascinating to me is that the 3 interviews were not always very coherent in terms of, even though things happened, when they would switch to talking about their experiences as supervisors, it didn't always show that they were aware of the things they had told me of what it was like to be a supervisee. So that's beyond the scope of what we're doing here. And you could learn more about it by reading my own dissertation. But what I want you to do is to think about, how can I get at the material I want? I wanted to know about supervisors in good supervision, but I needed to know what was shaping their supervision. And I kept hearing that it was the way they were supervised. So I just let them talk to me about it, and then talk to me about what they did, and then tell me what they thought made a good supervisor. And learn, it helped me to understand that although some of the practices that they found most belittling and the things that held them back the most were still being done by themselves, they were employing these very same things, that it didn't gel with what they necessarily thought a good supervisor should do. And yet they were still doing them. And it was interesting. It wasn't done to try to beat up on supervisors, but to better understand, like, why do we do things, especially if we don't think they're very effective? So it's trying to break your question down into component parts so that you can have a shape for your literature review. So it's really thinking about, what is the question I want to answer? And sometimes, by going to the literature, and that's where these librarians come in. If you have a great question, but it's bringing back 350,000 responses, you realize your question must be much too broad, and you're going to have to narrow it down. On the other hand, if you have a question that brings back 3 responses, it may be that your question is just way too narrow. So it isn't an exact science. It involves a lot of conversations with people on your committee and others, and going to the literature and reading to get started. Here's an activity that you can take if you haven't gotten to that point, and it's just developing. We're not going to do it now, but taking a few minutes to develop a question that could drive the dissertation literature review or an article that you're currently working on, and then thinking about what you've read so far. What are some of the keywords that keep coming up that could serve as the springboard for sections of your dissertation? And then how are those keywords related to your initial question and potentially follow-up questions? So this is something you can do on your own. Now, I've talked about the research, but I'll admit I am not a librarian, although I watch them in action a lot, and I make a lot of research consultations myself. I cannot say enough that I would never go out to do my own research study without consulting the experts, because they know what literature to look at. And continue. I'm always surprised in 2022 that I can sit down with a student and I'll ask them what databases they've searched and they tell me Google Scholar. And like info, what is it, that broad one that comes up when you first go to Kresge Library, if you want journals, there's kind of a wide open search for journal articles. And I go, okay, we need to get a little more specific here. But if words like psych info, if you're in psychology or counseling and you don't already know psych info, stop writing and go back to searching. If you're in education and you don't know Eric or education, Sage Education, stop what you're doing and going back. So it's going to them and finding out what databases best serve your field. And then again, they know that all words are not created equally. Too often we might look under a word like education, or we might say homosexual, but it was homosexuality. If we use the term without truncation, a symbol that'll allow us to pick homosexuality, homosexual, education, educational, education, whatever, in a hyphen, we're not going to get everything that's available to us. They also can teach us how to break down the search if we're looking specifically for peer-reviewed articles. Dissertations. In the 9-minute video, they mentioned dissertations. Some of the best stuff out there is actually in unpublished dissertations. We can get some really good stuff because people zeroed in on a topic, and just because it didn't get published doesn't mean you can't learn something from it. So looking there, but also getting a sense of how many studies are available. How do you know when your search has reached a saturation point? I hear that all the time. First, it's good when I hear people saying the same thing. That's not a waste of time. If you're reading articles, you will notice that often people will list for 3 or 4 articles and the date that they were written behind any given claim that they make. That is not a waste of time. That means something. That means experts in the field often agree on this. So we like to show that. But if you're continuing to search in different databases, if you're going further back in time, if you're going to bibliographies and looking at the bibliographies of new studies that you find, and you're seeing the same people cited over and over again, maybe an earlier article or a later article, you might be at saturation point. So those are some of the things to do. But again, please don't rely on Sherry alone. This list came from working with librarians, and also please understand the difference between a primary and a secondary source. A primary source might be, and if you were doing research on journals from women who lived out on the plains in the early 1800s. A secondary source would be people who have already looked at those journals and read other experiences, and they're writing articles about that. You might read studies about other studies, but if it's an important study, don't rely on the secondary source, go read the original. So if your study is looking at a very specific theory and it was first proposed by Carl Rogers, who's a psychologist, it's very important that you read Carl Rogers, not just the people who have come after him and who have digested his work. So I'm going to skip through that stuff. We're going to look at preparing and organizing your review. I don't like to belabor a discussion of plagiarism. And the only reason I want to bring up plagiarism is because it often occurs, unintentional plagiarism occurs because of poor research habits. We don't get into the habit of adding the articles that we've looked at to our search database, of recording the full citation and a way of getting back to it, if we took notes of clearly indicating what was a direct quote versus what was our notes and ideas in response to it. So as you're searching, you might want to, and again, this is something that the research librarians are really helpful with. At OU, we use RefWorks, or I should say Kresge Library promotes the use of RefWorks. But aren't we having a workshop here coming up soon, Tori, on another, what would you like to join in right now?
Sure, yeah, we're having a workshop on Mendeley, which is a free open source. And that is, I believe, Wednesday night, February 9th, but I will double check and put that in the chat.
So it's a great idea. First of all, pitch the note cards. It's too easy to lose them. Yes, I still like to do things with pencil and paper when I talk, when I'm doing a presentation. If there's something that came up, I tend to write it down. But you need a methodical way of tracing everything that you've looked at and keeping track of everything that you've looked at. And a methodical way of keeping track of your notes in relationship to these specific articles, because over time, you may end up having 200 articles. My own dissertation drew upon over 300 articles, and probably because it's my work too, that's why I had so many. I wouldn't suggest that anybody here needs to have that many in your reference page, but because it's related to my work, I was reading these things for my job as a writing center director anyway. And then as you're reading, you need a way also to start thinking about how you're going to represent this information into a larger work. Marcus mentioned the A, B's, and C's. Somebody else mentioned selective, which means I'm focusing in on one part, not I only want to read people I like versus I don't. But you have to start thinking about, based on how other people have organized the literature and what I'm hearing, what will make most sense for my study? How do I need? Is it going to be based in terms of different types of stakeholders? Is it going to be drawn around different theories? Is it going to be based on conflicts in findings? How am I going to organize the literature? Are there like 6 or 7 what I call major talking points? Is it going to be on different research methodologies? Maybe you're making the case for a different approach to research in the field. If you find that you're not getting much, great time to stop and go see a research librarian and to talk to your committee, to your chair. It could be, as I said, as simple as maybe I'm using the wrong terms, or I'm not looking in the right database, or I missed out on something seminal because it's been a while since it was published. And if you find too many, it's time to really dig in to see of all the stuff out there, where does my research interest lie? And where can I make my mark? Where is the gap within this largely covered subject matter? We do mention here that making an annotated bibliography can be really helpful. And that's just as you read a source, briefly creating a notation system that you can use with something like Mendeley 2 or any other like note-taking and reference system. What's the research methodology? What are the findings? What are some of the key discussion points in the article? So you could have maybe a 3 to 5 sentence kind of like format for your annotation, so that once you've read 100 articles and you can't remember who wrote what anymore, you can quickly sift through it electronically and pull up all the articles that were a certain kind of study with this finding, or those that used those that had, this key term in it. So usually, again, this is going to be an electronic way, something that's very searchable and easy. I do want to note, however, that an annotated bibliography should never be directly inserted into your literature review. This isn't like I'm doing my homework now so I don't have to do it later. Yes, you're doing it now, and this is great information, but you're going to have to change it when it goes into the lit review, because there's nothing worse than reading a lit review that is an annotated bibliography in drag. Study 1 says blah, 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 blah. In another study, Jones said this. He had 365 participants who, and you're like, so what? The topic was, children and autism and why they are slow to show any kind of verbalization. And each paragraph in that section of your bibliography says Jones conducted a study of 655 students. And you're like, I'm really starting to forget that the focus was on late verbalization, because I got 6 sentences on all this stuff about the method and very little that shaped it at the beginning, telling me to better understand why children are late to verbalize, blah, blah, blah. Researchers have conducted studies that include. And then I go into some information about a study, but just shoving annotated bibliographies in there and calling it a lit review, that is, it is inappropriate, and it's gonna cause you a lot of rewriting. And I wish I could have intervened earlier. I've had people come to me with 50-page lit reviews that were nothing more than a long list of studies annotations from A to Z. And that's why I like to introduce this concept of writing from a source grid. It sounds more complicated than it is. When I was a young student, I almost didn't graduate high school with an A in English, even though I deserved it, and I did. I loved writing and I loved doing research, because I hated writing Roman numeral outlines. My thinking was, how can I outline what I'm going to do before I've done it? It just seemed so ridiculous to me to say, here's what I'm going to say. These are all the parts, and it's going to come together this way. And it continued to be a problem for me for years, and organization continued to be a problem for me. And then one day it kind of hit me, but I'll admit it wasn't until I was a faculty member, that somewhere along the line, as I was reading lots of articles, I got a sense of, here are the things I want to talk about. And it was at that moment that I needed some sort of outline, but the Roman numeral outline wasn't going to do it for me, because I didn't want to commit to, and this topic's going to be first and this topic's going to be second yet. So this may work for you as you're reading. Let's say you're into the reading, and I know Marcus is working on some things related to sports and career aspirations, and you're reading and you see this important issue of like how race reflects how an athlete identifies. And you see it raised in more than one study, and you say, okay, race. So what role does race play in athletic identity? That might be a whole section of the lit review. So in subsequent studies, as you're reading them, you get to mention of race and athletic identity, and it's like a little light bulb goes on in your head, and you want to make sure that you can quickly connect that study to the other studies that you've read. So what I started doing was creating a table called a source grid. And once I had gotten a pretty good sense of what I was dealing with, I said, here are about like 5 things that I really need to talk about. And this is directions for how to do it. But what I wanted to show you is, so I had read several studies, and I kept seeing things like, okay, race is an important concept in athletic identity. Gender is an important concept. Another is whether or not the school is like a top-notch athletic program, or whether it is a school where they maybe give some scholarships. for athletes to play. So whether it was like a Big Ten type school or another. And so I would start tracing that just as I did for my own work on supervision. So when I first started, this was my original supervision source grid. The very first thing I did is in the first column, once I figured out what my major talking points were, the first column, I put my APA, MLA, IEEE, MLA, whatever it was, citation for the study that I read. In column 1, which doesn't correspond to the first part of my study, I put my first section or topic or what I call talking point. So for my early work that I was doing on support for grad students, my first talking point was that I kept coming across this idea that the dissertation is so different from any other academic assignment, that when grad school students finished grad school and they went into the dissertation stage, they often felt completely unprepared, even though they had written many, many papers. And a lot of students got stuck in that stage and they never finished. So I knew anytime I read an article, I wanted to look to see how they defined the dissertation and its relationship to other types of writing. And so when I found it in that column, I would put some information. If the article didn't address it, I'd skip it. The second talking point was that I found a lot of the committee members had very little preparation for helping people write. So you've got this writing task that is so different from anything else you've ever done before. And most of the members of your committee, even though they know how to write and they publish things, they don't know how to help you to write. So as I read future articles, anytime people talked about that difficulty that faculty had helping people write, I looked for it and I put that information in. So when I read Garbus's article, I looked to see if Garbus had anything on how the dissertation is different, and Garbus did. You'll notice I put it in quotations because at that point I was just putting quotes in. What that did for me was remind me that those aren't my words. I went to the second talking point that I was interested in. I found there was information on that, on the lack of writing preparation. So then I went to my third one, publication gaps, that a lot of the resources designed for graduate students to help them finish the PhD, they assumed that graduate students had power that they didn't. And they also weren't at all aimed at the people who made all the decisions, like the chairs and the committee. So the chairs and the committee also needed to know how to make sure somebody finished the dissertation. And if they weren't on board, you could be doing all kinds of things. That didn't mean your dissertation was going to get accepted. My fourth one was that writing centers were very uncomfortable and often not prepared to provide help for graduate writers, and that a lot of writing centers didn't. Garbus's article didn't talk about it, so you'll notice I didn't put anything there. And then at that time, I was using a column called potential interventions. You don't need one, but what I was doing is I was setting up a way of organizing all of this stuff. By the way, this source grid grew to reflect well over 100 articles before I was finished with it. And why does it matter? Because as I read new articles, obviously, I did not go back to every single article I'd ever read in the past and try to shove it all in here. I picked the ones that I thought were saying a lot of the same things, and I would cross-reference them. But as I read new articles like Powers, I would look at Powers. Does it have anything about the dissertation genre? Yes, good. I read it to see if it said anything about the training faculty got. As I moved forward, I would fill this grid in. It was like a way of creating an outline of information of cross-referencing similar articles. So I could go to the first column and dump that first column into a Word document, and I could write around it. And soon I had 4, 5, 6 studies that were all talking about the same thing. And it became easy to say, to take my column header, and turn it into the introduction. Many authors, many researchers have demonstrated that the dissertation is not like any other academic assignment. This may explain why somewhere between 25 and 40% of students quit at the dissertation stage. And then I would go into the research and I would pull in what I needed to help people understand how the dissertation is different from other writing genres in grad school. Once I was done with that, I could go to another column when I thought I was done, dump that into a Word document, and I could write around all those quotes and notes. I didn't forget good scholars. I didn't write from the top of the pile. So I know for a lot of you, if you find a really good, like a really good lit review, you keep relying on it. So it looks like the only person you read was Smith, and you read him in 2021. But he's not the only person you read. He's just the one you remember because you read him most recently, because it was November 2021. And by then you'd read so much, but some of this stuff you read 4 years ago, you don't remember. You think you will remember. This also allowed me not to get into the trap of attributing something to the wrong person. And it helped me to sift through all that stuff I was reading and focus in on what I thought were the most important talking points for my dissertation based on my research project. So I've given you this as a template that you can look at. I've even included a version of mine for you to look at in the resources that are appended to the end. So you can read over the approach. That's one tool that I've been using now with grad students here at Oakland to help them with their lit review for almost 20 years. And I will say that in the education department, some of the faculty have made that a part of the process of their students writing their proposals, and they have had pretty good results. We had planned to do a study of it, and life got in the way, COVID got in the way, and my colleague retired. So I don't know if it's going to happen, but I can tell you I've got a lot of good, at least anecdotal support for using an approach like that. And certainly I'm not saying you must use the source grid. What I'm saying is something methodical that helps you to organize and sift through all the material that you have and figure out what you think is going to be most important. And it's something you can demonstrate to your team too. You can share. My students shared their source grids with me, and we have the most enlightening discussions. Sometimes they don't share a draft with me first, they share a source grid. I look through it and I draw a lot of initial conclusions. And then we sit down and they talk to me and I'll go, hey, I noticed this. And that fits with what you just said, or you said a lot about this, but I didn't see anything here. How does that fit in? And boy, they tell me that when they leave my office, sometimes they go straight outside of the writing center. This was when we were all on campus, and they sit down at a computer and they just start writing because it helped them kind of get a conceptual sense of where they should be going with that dissertation. Does anybody have any questions right now or comments?
Yes, actually, I do have a comment. You mentioned that one of the sources that we can depend on literature review dissertations, even those dissertations that were not published, that do
Right.
not, discredit or disparage the value of this dissertation. My question here, that if the literature review rely maybe more on those dissertations than scholarly articles that were published on the famous journal of the field. Do you think that will maybe just
No, I think what you can say is sometimes dissertations address things that aren't getting much attention or aren't solidified, or they return to topics that have gaps that maybe we don't see reflected in the published literature. So you can use them to help flesh out a fuller picture, but certainly you wouldn't go with the unpublished dissertations at the expense of the published literature. It could be, especially if it's newer work, you can talk about where the published literature is left off, and then in the lit review, draw attention to some newer scholarship that has maybe talked about new ways to filter noise in engineering and how they're doing. So it would be, of course, the published literature is always going to be the most important. But if there are some questions that are unanswered or new things being done, and they're addressed in a more recent dissertation, then you can pull that in to help us see what's available.
So in other words, it will give your research more weight if you depend on those articles that were published, correct? And I heard once from one of my professor actually statement about that's not to worry too much about the dissertation because sometimes maybe the worst paper that you can do in your life.
Yeah, we all say that your dissertation is the beginning of your academic career, not the end. But with that said, some really good work gets done in dissertations, and for whatever reason, it might not be the grant that was supported at the time. There's a lot of good information that was in dissertations, but it doesn't always end up getting published, and that's unfortunate. In engineering, a lot of times the stuff's already been published before it even goes in the dissertation. But I have seen, especially in places like education and in education, where a lot of good research was done, but for whatever reason, and in my field of writing studies, because they were maybe trying to get jobs in other parts of the field of writing and rhetoric, they did a great study. No one else in writing and rhetoric, no one else in writing studies has done it, but they didn't publish it. And if I hadn't looked at dissertations too, I would have missed out on some good information. But yes, the published studies, yes, they are, even if, they might be wrong, but they're always going to be more credible in the long run because they're published and they've been vetted through the peer review process.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? These are really good ones.
The source grid, do you have a blank copy of that, or is just like, how can we make a copy of that?
No, I can make a copy. I think we shared the document with you. I'll add a blank version of a source grid for you, and you can make it any way you want.
Yeah, there's the one you used. Sorry, Sherry. The one that Sherry was just using is in the chat. So you can use that, or we can make one available.
Yeah, I've got a blank one. I forgot to put it in here, so I'll add it to the presentation. And you shared the presentation at the beginning, didn't you, Tori?
Yes, but if you joined later, just drop your email in the chat and I can.
Yeah, and I can share it again before we end here, because I'm going to kind of start winding things down because there's a lot of information in this. This used to be a 2-day workshop that I used to do with a librarian. So there's a lot of information here, more so than, and we usually did it in 2-3 hour sessions. So I just kind of wanted to digest it down to the things that I thought were going to be most helpful to you. So when we move from the source grid to the drafting of this, we're really keeping in mind, again, that purpose. We have a research question, and our goal is to synthesize, right? So not annotated bib, study, but more synthesis. Start with an overviewing the purpose of that section. So to better understand the dissertation as a novel genre, and then look at any research available on that novel genre. Maybe start with one. You might share the number of research subjects and the results. And then you might go on in the next one and say, likewise, Jones did a follow-up study in 2020, and he found X. In a different, with a different emphasis, Smith looked at X and found blah, blah, blah. So we're synthesizing. We're pulling the studies together and showing how they're similar and how they're different. We're identifying and explaining those inconsistencies when it's relevant and important. And we're, we're identifying gaps in the current research so that it's clear that this dissertation should be finished and published because you're adding to the professional literature. And I just wanted to give you an example of a paragraph that looks more like the synthesis paragraph than the annotated bibliography. And this comes from education, comes from one of the rough drafts of my own work. And so here, just something that shows how it's framed by a concept, not a single study or author. So really get in the habit of thinking, when I start my paragraphs in my lit review, whether my lit review is a small section of each chapter or it's part of an article that I'm writing, each paragraph should be able to stand on its own and help focus us on the idea being covered, not the researcher. When it's focused on the researcher, we're often not doing synthesis. We're name dropping. So when we look at this first sentence, to better understand dissertators' feedback experience within the aforementioned supervisory relationships, researchers have solicited students' perspectives. So I'm saying they went to the students, they asked the students. And what I've got a list here, we've got Can and Cannon Walker and East. So I'm showing more than one researcher has done this. My next sentence now can identify a very specific study. Can's dissertation survey and interview research, for example, identified 12 categories of writing for which social science doctoral students expressed the need for feedback and discuss student responses to different feedback factors. So I go to the dissertation, and what did we learn in the dissertation? He identified 12 categories that students, through his research, had suggested they needed help with. And his study also discussed student responses to different feedback factors that were identified. He found that respondents objected to marks without text. And this has been true of me, and I bet you it's true of some of you. When somebody underlines text and it's got a squiggly line, but you don't know why. Or when it's just got a little question mark next to it, and here you are, the reader, going, why? And then so I give the specific research again, Can 2009 in the page number. And then you'll notice when faculty supervisors justified their comments, provided clear revision guidelines, and offered their feedback with a less directive and respectful tone, however, students were more likely to revise. And here's where I switched to more synthesis. These findings complemented earlier research by Ayres, Hatch, Turner, and West. So in this one, and I think I forgot to share my screen, so I apologize for that. In this one, we're seeing real synthesis taking place. So again, this is from education. So the approach that's used here was APA, American Psychological Association. So it's not going to be the same as it would be for somebody in engineering. Whereas in the next one, I've got an example of an engineering paragraph, and you'll notice a lot of numbers. Those numbers mean a lot of studies that go with that first sentence. A number of researchers have found that cells will align with multiple grooves on a substrate. So that's another way of demonstrating lots of research has been done on this, and they have found the following. So it looks different, but that's from engineering. But again, that first sentence is focused on telling us about a topic, not telling us about a specific author. It didn't say 9 has found that cells will align with multiple grooves on a substrate, which I've read a lot of sentences like that. The new paragraph, the new section of the dissertation starts off with a number like 9 instead of, and then I have to go to the works cited page or the reference page, and I have to see who wrote Article 9. That tells us something very specific. And then it's moving on. The degree of orientation depended on the cell type, surface, groove density. And it continues on with another citation and a few more citations. So although it looks different because it's done in engineering rather than in education, the approach is still synthesis. We're still seeing a topic being discussed with research support so that we can better understand it. I want to move forward because we don't have a lot of time left to some of the common mistakes that we want to think about. Obviously, the next time I do this, we'll want to give ourselves a little more time. But here are some of the mistakes, and some of them I've mentioned. Attempting to review literature for a question that is too broad. You know, we can't be all things to all people. We cannot write the dissertation on nursing from the time of Florence Nightingale. We will never finish. And we don't have an audience for that work. There are people who write tomes or long histories. That's not your job. Conducting a cursory search, which just means a haphazard search of the literature. Your search strategy matters, and that's why in your literature review, whether it's in the section or it's in the chapter, many fields have us tell what terms they used, what they found, and what they didn't find. It's less common to see that in engineering and science, but it's very common to see a statement like that in health sciences, in psychology, in education. So again, some of these things are very discipline specific. Bias, so we mentioned selective does not mean that we choose not to use something that took a long time to read, or it was difficult, or we didn't like their findings because they conflict with what we were hoping to find. Including only articles that you can find through Google Scholar or full text article databases at your school. We have a responsibility to know the literature, not just the literature at Oakland University, not just the literature freely available via Google. Failing to search beyond a narrow field or discipline. In many cases, our field may provide everything that we need, but especially when you find that your search results are limited, there are times when we have to extrapolate. We have to move out into similar fields. So if you're in psychology, you might look at psychiatry. You might also look at counseling literature. If you're in nursing, you might look at medical literature or physical therapy literature to see if there's something similar. Including theoretical opinion or editorial articles. Now, there are some literature reviews that include theory as one section of the review. That's different from what we're talking about here, where you're relying specifically on editorial articles or simply on theory and opinion. So you might have a section of the literature where it's focused on specific theories and research that has been done using those theories, but it's atypical of most literature reviews to simply include theoretical discussions or, let's say, pedagogical resources. We tend to want to focus on empirical studies in our lit review. And the other mistake, and I think it's because people misunderstand what it means to be critical, is failing to be critical in your review. Again, if there is something that is confusing, if there is a conflict, if there's something you can add to the discussion to help us better understand why somebody got these results that seem to conflict with many other results, then it's your job as the person helping us navigate this big body of literature to see that. You're not telling us that you're right. You're not telling us not to read something or that it's wrong. You're helping us understand what might explain a conflict. Writing consultations, I can't, and I think most of the people here have already had them, but I can't emphasize enough how important a research consultation is. And I hope some of the things I mentioned today will encourage you, even if you are in the middle of the process. If you've taken any kind of break, and I know I did, and I know a couple of you have too, it's a good idea to do a search to see if something new has come out. I know it's scary because, oh gosh, somebody might have learned something that I'm trying to share right now, but better you learn it now than when you get ready to defend. When should you have a writing consultation? Pretty much any point in the process. Sometimes people just don't know where to get started, and they just need someone like me who's done this a couple times. I've written 2 dissertations. To sit down with you in 2 different fields and just listen to you and try to help you navigate all these resources that I talked about. We have a nice conversation. Other times you've got a draft done, but you want some feedback. You might even feel good about it. And I might feel good about it too. Your committee might, but it's nice to get some feedback and to have somebody read through it with you. If you're struggling with something and you don't know how to get started, for example, Tori is an excellent resource for people who are maybe writing their first methodology. Now, she is a social scientist, but she's also pretty good with listening, and I am too. And I've helped people work on their methodology sections, even though they're in fields that are different from my own. And we also know what questions to ask. Or if you've written up your findings and you're not sure if you've satisfied your findings, I can't promise you that it's going to go through committee and everybody's going to be happy with it, but I can serve as a first audience for you. So what we're basically saying is anytime you need a second set of eyes or ears, and it's better to get that earlier on and get some feedback than it is to be sent to us later. So what have you learned today? Well, it took me almost 2 hours to tell you that writing a good literature review is time consuming, and I bet some of you already know that. And it requires organization and critical thinking. But a well-constructed review is what enables you as a researcher, you as a thinker, to become an asset to your field. So our goal is to become a member of the field. You are writing yourself into the discipline of psychology or engineering or nursing or educational leadership. You start as a novice, but by the time that you finish your dissertation, you are presenting yourself as a scholar, as a colleague. And your contribution should show that you know more about this topic than anybody else in that room. Any of those scholars who are making decisions about whether or not you deserve your degree. So they're counting on you to have learned to be a colleague. So resources that I have, tools to guide the process. So I gave you an overview of the literature review with some of the common pitfalls. It's a different document than this. I've got instructions for assembling the source grid. I'll add a blank source grid to that. The article that I suggested that I was a really good read, no matter what field you're in, with the figure that overviews the main evaluatory practices for a lit review is there. And then on last resource, when I was talking about the word synthesis and connecting resources together, if that's hard for you, it might be hard for you because you don't see yourself as a writer. It might be hard for you because English is not your first language. It might be hard for you because you're so focused on the hard work of explaining these difficult processes that you forget about transitions and things that are going to help. This book that I've linked to, They Say, I Say, The Moves That Matter in Academic Writing, It's slender. It's about $25. I used to have a lot of extra copies of it. I don't now. Otherwise, I would hand them out in my office. But you can get this book, and it has a series of templates that help you show the relationship between and among different ideas. So how to introduce a conflict between two sources, how to show that your ideas are similar to those of other people. So literal templates, little like sentence starters that you could employ to help improve your synthesis skills. So those are just a few. And then what I've included is all the resources that I drew upon to put this presentation together. So I'm going to stop sharing here. We have about 10 minutes left, and I just wanted to open up this time to anybody who had additional questions or comments, and I'll put the link to the presentation in there again.
Yep, the link is in there to the presentation. The link is in there to the source grid. And I just put a third link in there to a survey. If you guys would give us some feedback today about our workshop, and then we'll make sure using that feedback that you guys will get emails on our next couple workshops, including the one on Mendeley from 5 to 6 p.m. on Wednesday, February 9th.
So does anybody have any comments or questions or something that you wished I had discussed here that I didn't? Obviously, 2 hours is a long time, but it's not enough time to go over everything.
Thank you very much. Actually, I joined a few minutes, I mean, after the beginning, so maybe everybody introduce himself and herself, and I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Abdul Hammami. I am in my third year in the PhD in the field of educational leadership. I'm almost in the dissertation stage there. Actually, my question now for the literature review, how much do you think is fair, how much space we should designate for each source of the literature review in the dissertation? Half a page, 1 page, or it depends on there is no.
Yeah, it's really hard because some sources, like I said, especially if there's a conflict, you might spend more time introducing more of the methodological information. So you might say, in a 3-decade study, and what kind of study it was of 200,000 students, researchers at X evaluated Y, and they learned this. And then the next 2 sentences later, it might just be likewise, Jones 2019 concluded that students are less likely to learn online. So the first one, you gave a lot of methodological details, and you might have even shown another study, and the next sentence might just be, Jones 2009 in a similar study, or in a qualitative study, Jones 2009 likewise concluded X. So it really is, it's like, you look at it, what are the studies that are most pivotal? Are there topics that are there, especially if your audience might be less likely to put its trust in a qualitative study versus a quantitative study? There's just so many factors that can play a role in that. I wish there were a nice little, a little formula that I could give you.
Thank you very much. I mean, also regarding using the term or the words, for example, when we want to start telling about the source, suppose, like, for example, Malcolm stated so and so in his, for example, article 2000 stated this fact, or he argued. So we use like those words, argue, stated, or explored. So it depends on the topic itself, if it is controversial, or if he is stating exactly his opinion or a fact. What do you think?
Yeah, those things can be an issue. For example, a lot of times in a lit review, opined, argued, proposed are used almost as synonyms, and not to mean like there is a debate versus, somebody stated. So it can mean something. There can be a difference between, in my world, there is a difference between somebody said they argued and they proposed something. But I noticed when I'm reading people's lit reviews, often those are all words that are used as synonyms to indicate somebody wrote something or conducted a study.
Thank you very much. Regarding the methodology, you named the doctor, I guess, that we can consult with for those who's right. I mean, they're interested in knowing more about the methodology, or who are the first time writing a methodology in their dissertation.
Yeah, that would be Tori up here in the who's my co-host for tonight. She is the Oakland University Writings Center's graduate assistant, and she's our statistical consulting resource. And is Red still here? And then one of your colleagues in the Ed Leadership Program, Red is also somebody that you can make appointments with. Red specialty, certainly Red